Hello, everyone, and welcome back to For the World. You may have seen the news that Extreme E is in its last season, so we wanted to give you a bit of background on its transition to the hydrogen based Extreme H. We've talked a little bit about this already, but we're going to give you more of a deep dive. But that's starting next season in 2025. So we'll go through a quick Hydrogen 101 and then dive into Christina. But before we start, we have a little exciting announcement. So, if you've been following For the World and you're interested in sustainability in motorsport, we will be doing a bi weekly newsletter. So, stay tuned for that. We'll be sourcing emails from you, but it'll come to your email, your inbox. And we'll send that out bi weekly with everything that's going on in the sustainability and motorsport world. With that, I'm Tiggy.
And I'm Chessa. Okay, so Extreme E is in its fourth and final season, and as it prepares to transition to the hydrogen based Extreme H next year for 2025, that would give you a little bit of context about that transition, like Tiggy said. So, Extreme E had its first Desert X Prix in Saudi this past February. They have 2 race weekends in Sardinia, and then the first ever Extreme E US event will be in Phoenix in November. And the whole concept of Extreme E is they're basically going to the most remote places in the world and showcasing that you can do really incredible electric racing without leaving a footprint. So that's why they're going to all these extreme locations. And as a reminder, there's lots of familiar F1 faces involved in the championship. We have McLaren, of course, Carlos Sainz Sr., Carlos Sainz's dad, Nico Rosberg, Jenson Button, and then Lewis Hamilton previously had Team X44, but they will not be competing this year.
And a quick update on and what to expect for Extreme H. So it's the same format as Extreme E, but it's a different car, different technology, ultimately a different championship. If you want a reminder on Extreme E, we did a sort of what is Extreme E deep dive and interview with Alejandro Agag, who founded it. So check that out from last summer. But Extreme H had its first shakedown at the tail end of 2023. It's set to begin in 2025. So there is expected to be a hydrogen prototype coming to one of the extreme races towards the tail end of the calendar. So definitely look out for that. But let's talk briefly about the technology. Let's talk about hydrogen and why it's an interesting technology for motorsport, but also beyond. I think when most people think of hydrogen, they think of the Hindenburg disaster, which is
Oh my
when
goodness.
a giant German airship, which was filled with hydrogen gas, extremely flammable, obviously burst into an enormous fireball over New Jersey. This was in 1937. So using hydrogen now is much safer, especially to power mobility. And it's a hot topic in the climate world because of its potential as a source of sustainable fuel. So super interesting technology. We'll dive a little bit into that.
Hot topic, no pun intended. I like it. So it's critical to note that hydrogen is only as, quote, sustainable as the processes used to produce it, as is a lot of things in this whole sustainability conversation. So hydrogen tech isn't at the stage yet where it can be deployed at scale. And that's why Extreme H, sort of like testing out the limits and how this is actually going to function in practice, is going to be so important. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and it's the smallest element on the periodic scale, but it definitely takes significant effort to turn that tiny little molecule into something usable. And unlike fossil fuels and a lot of sources of renewable energy, like what we usually think of off the top of our heads, like wind and solar, and are the primary sources of energy, hydrogen fuel requires a lot of chemical processes to produce it. So it's not as easy as just saying, okay, we're going to use hydrogen, let's go. It's in great demand in the agricultural sector, in the semiconductor industries, and lots of other industries are gearing up for this potential shift in using hydrogen power as well.
Yeah, definitely. And so by switching the E, which electric in Extreme E, to H or hydrogen, you're essentially just changing the power source of the series, but that's complicated and a complex thing to do. So we've talked a little bit about green in the past, but green hydrogen fuel, which is hydrogen procured in a sustainable manner, and fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells, are what's replacing the electricity and the batteries in the Odyssey cars as the main power source. So Symbio is the official hydrogen fuel cell provider of Extreme E/Extreme H. There will still be some other battery systems in there from Williams for a hybrid like hydrogen and battery electric system. Super, super interesting in terms of technology, in addition to a new chassis. But without getting into all the sort of electrical and chemical sciencey type stuff, with a hydrogen fuel cell, it works sort of like a battery. A catalyst is used to react hydrogen fuel and oxygen with some electrolytes, resulting in protons and electrons, and getting energy and power and water vapor on the other side of the reaction. There's no harmful CO2 or other byproducts like there would be with a combustion engine. So it's effectively a zero emissions solution, which is why it's so exciting. And the energy from that reaction goes into the circuit that's connected to your electric motor, which then turns the wheels. But the whole point here is that the hydrogen, very much like the electricity the series currently uses, that's powering the fuel cell has to come from somewhere sustainable. And sourcing hydrogen is where things get a little tricky.
So, currently, the most common and cost effective way of sourcing hydrogen fuel is reforming. And that kind of involves reacting methane sources like natural gas. So, methane is a greenhouse gas that is a lot more potent than just CO2. So, it takes reacting the methane sources like the natural gas with steam. And while this process produces hydrogen fuel, it also, like other fossil fuel combustions, does release significant amounts of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, and the whole process requires a lot of dirty energy to get this process to take place at all. That is like the biggest catch 22 that is the biggest challenge right now. But with Extreme H, it'll be using green hydrogen, which is produced by splitting water into hydrogen and then oxygen, and then using renewable electricity from wind and solar energy, aka electrolysis, rather than the methane energy that I just talked about. So it's a much less energy intensive reforming process.
So, before we transition to the interview, we wanted to introduce a new member of our For the World team for the summer, Fiona. Fiona is doing her master's in climate and society at Columbia, bringing her sustainability and motorsports expertise to the podcast this summer. So, expect to see her, hear her voice on some upcoming episodes. But, Fiona, we wanted to give a chance to introduce yourself. Welcome.
Thank y'all so much. I'm so excited to be here. And I'm also very equally excited to talk about hydrogen today because it's not something that the public gets to hear about very much. So it's a great opportunity.
Totally. So, tell us from your perspective, why does a series driven by hydrogen matter?
So, the technical director of Extreme E, Mark Crane, who's managing this hydrogen switch, talked about this in a recent interview, and I thought that he put it really well. Essentially, hydrogen regulations when it comes to mobility don't really exist because the tech is so new. So, Extreme H is almost like a literal and metaphorical crash test of the whole concept from the safety and sporting regulation standpoint all the way down to the durability and the lifespan of the the fuel cells themselves. And if you think about what happened with electric vehicles, consumers often have a lot of range anxiety, right? So this is
Mhm.
essentially like trying to find a way to bring that range anxiety down. But especially when it comes to generating green hydrogen from renewable energy in some of the most remote and challenging racing environments on Earth and testing the range of those fuel cells in those same environments, this to me is why it's particularly exciting. And then again, like coming down to the impact that I always want to say Formula E because to me, they're both doing such a great job when it comes to
There's
this
so
stuff.
many. Yeah.
I know. But Extreme E, from an equity standpoint, testing this tech has a lot of potential because hydrogen fuel cells could be a really amazing lifeline for lots of energy poor communities just because hydrogen fuel is extremely energy dense, meaning that it has a lot of energy per unit mass, so it can last long and power lots of stuff. Plus, if you can make water using wind and solar energy, say in the desert, that's a really accessible fuel source. And
Right.
finally, like the hope is that sustainable tech, like so many other innovations in motorsport, will end up en masse in road cars, right? So getting consumers excited about hydrogen's potential and also its safety in the hydro green generation piece is critical.
Totally. I think that's also well said. And it's going to be interesting to follow how this works. I think sometimes there are people who are more skeptical about, oh, can motorsport series really change the tech or really be a good proving ground for these sorts of things? But I think we have seen those use cases in the past. And I think especially with something like hydrogen from a mobility standpoint, like who else really is doing this?
Yeah. And there's a lot of debate in the energy space right now, like with electric vehicles, about what the inflection point for hydrogen is going to be.
Mhm.
For
Interesting.
example, Toyota right now is really the brand that's put its bets on hydrogen fuel cell tech in its cars. But, the thing comes down to once consumers can really get their hands on this tech, which might happen at the same time that the series is in full swing, it's really critical that they ask the question, where's my hydrogen coming from? What energy is going into its production? Because not all hydrogen is created equal. So having the series really be a leader in creating the green hydrogen that's needed to power these cars and also being very vocal about where it's coming from is something that we should really look out for.
Yeah, I'm super excited. And Extreme E and I'm sure Extreme H will do the same thing, but they're so good about like the educational aspect of it and showing their communities what they're doing, anyone who's watching. So a lot of exciting things to come.
Yeah, I think we're going to need a part 2 in 2025 when this kicks off, and we'll hopefully have more information.
Yes.